coming up next, we have Madeline Hoying. Yes. So as we give us a moment to pull up your deck here. Let's see. So Madeline is a PhD candidate at MIT and Harvard in medical engineering and medical physics, right? No big deal. Her research investigates aerospace physiology, leading to novel medical devices for long duration space flight. So that's part of why these two talks were together, is we're talking about impacts on the body for long duration space flight and or being out beyond the Earth. So she also designs and leads analogs. And the topic of this talk is flexible analog design for operational risk management. Everyone, Madeline Hoying.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So in addition to my studies in aerospace engineering at MIT and Harvard Medical School, my background also includes 5 tours as an intern with the Central Intelligence Agency. And so what you're going to see here is a combination of the systems engineering of aerospace, the medical side of what happens to the human body, and combining it with that operational fieldwork aspect to figure out how we can best handle emergency situations that arise on these long duration missions. So current analog facilities exist, right? So why do we need this new flexible architecture that I'm going to be explaining? The current mission architectures or current analog facilities are, for the most part, designed based off of this historical mission view of having a single crew that's relatively small. They might have 1 or 2 module habitat setups, but it tends to be relatively constrained. And this was in large part due to the high cost of launching mass for these far trips into space. As we go towards things like Starship and the development of these higher capacity launch vehicles that we see starting to bring down the launch costs, we have the possibility of having these larger mission architectures. And with this comes a larger scientific return, but also more safety because we simply have more people in the case of emergencies. So when we look at the limitations of current analog facilities, we have a high cost associated with building a new facility, right? If we're to build a facility for every analog mission architecture or every Mars mission architecture, that's really expensive. It's not cheap to build. We also, so we have this limited flexibility in architecture, limited crew spots because these mission facilities were designed for this set mission profile of a single crew. So our solution that we're proposing, this method that will apply to the rest of the research shown here, is a large-scale analog framework that's based on the model that is used in clinical trials in medicine. So we, next one. Oh, these are going to go individually. Slide through them. Yeah, there are 9 of them. All right. So when we look at doing medical device development, we start with benchtop testing. We move to animal models, then we move to clinical trials. All right, this is kind of the standard model. That preclinical model selection criteria is used by the NIH in a lot of studies. Basically, the idea is you pick the lowest fidelity model that will allow you to get the results of the study that you're looking for. So in simple terms, you're not going to test in a monkey if you can do the same study, get the same result in a tissue model. You pick the lowest fidelity model possible. So we propose to apply that to space missions as well. We're not just looking for what analog facility has openings, we're looking for what is the lowest fidelity model that we can test in. So there are 3 here. Thank you. So we simplify that criteria to just these 3 features. We look for appropriateness as an analog. Is it a low fidelity simulation, but does it still give us that answer to that research question? Transferability of information, how good of an analog is it for that question that we're looking at? And then, of course, cost and availability is always going to be an important factor. So we're going to actually apply that to 2 missions here. The first one is Pale Red Dot. So Pale Red Dot is a large-scale 10-year mission architecture for the surface of Mars. This was designed in response to a NASA call for proposals, trade study analysis, things like that, not a real mission that's planned yet. But some of the key features here is that this is a 10-year mission that's meant to be homesteading. So it's not meant to rely on a lot of input from Earth regularly. So we did a very detailed time model, crew time model calculation, and we were able to show that having a small crew is not sustainable for a long mission. In terms of if something goes wrong, if something breaks, there's simply not enough crew time to be able to fix it. So we showed that we need a minimum of 36 people to go to Mars for 10 years to account for those unknown unknowns. And this model is published, and I'll show that reference at the end, so you guys can take a look at that. We also included having mission control on Mars. And critically, this is where that CIA experience comes in. We included a self-rescue capability by having 2 identical facilities next to each other. So we can split the crew between those 2. And this introduces more self-rescue options. We'll go into more detail on that later. And then 2 other key components of this mission architecture is thriving as a requirement. They're there for 10 years. We want them to have psychosocial health throughout. And we wanted this to, again, be that homesteading type mission. So we have 90% manufacturability by mass of all components using the resources available on Mars. So we have full industrial pipelines ready to go to only require for 10 people, or a 10-year mission, 36 people. We only require a 5-ton resupply mission every 2 years. Very low reliance on Earth. So when we take these 5 criteria and we look at how we would design an analog to test these critical components on the surface of Earth. So for that 36-person crew, we decided to take a minimum of 5 people per village. This exceeds the standard crew size of 3, so we moved past that psychosocial barrier there. Mission control on Mars, we wanted to keep the same, so one of those 5 people is assigned to the mission control role. We kept it as 2 independent villages, looking for that lowest fidelity model selection that we can do to design for the mission. Thriving as a requirement, we looked for including scheduled time for creative activities. So we're not scheduling out every minute of the crew day. We're focusing on including other activities that are beyond work. And we also included some low-level ISRU systems and industrial pipelines. So when we consider our criteria, we designed our mission with these criteria in mind, and we applied it to the Pale Red Dot analog mission that occurred in a remote area of Maine using RVs. All right. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here just for the sake of time, but this is kind of an overview of our mission. We had 11 people. They had dual technical specializations. We were quite successful in our industrial pipeline in particular. Now, we compared this to a standard mission, or a standard analog mission facility at the Mars Desert Research Station. When we looked at, this was kind of a mission of opportunity because we had another project going to MDRS already. So we wanted to look at how this architecture would be adapted to the MDRS facility. So taking that into consideration, we kept a minimum of 5 per village. We had a crew of 6 for the MDRS mission. Next one. Instead of keeping mission control on Mars, though, this time we had mission control run by MDRS, run by Ben right here. He was our mission control. We are his favorite crew. Feel free to ask him. Instead of having the self-rescue capability of 2 crews, because of the constraints of the MDRS structure, we only had a single crew of 6 people. So we used the single crew approach for recovery. It was a busy mission. It was designed within the within the Project Madman was the name of our main science experiment. So we didn't have scheduled creative time. We instead used that any free time we had could be used. And then instead of focusing on ISRU systems, our goal of the mission, next one, was to do this astrobiology, geobiology experiment. So this was a very high fidelity experiment that really was the purpose of going to MDRS. I want to emphasize this is not a knock on MDRS. It's just meant to show that, if you click one more time, sorry. Just meant to show that if we consider that analog model selection criteria, because of the nature of the MDRS facility being designed for a specific type of mission architecture, it becomes not the most feasible analog model for this bigger crew multi-site structure. All right. And again, not going to spend a ton of time here, but this is kind of the overview of our crew and some of the experiments that we did there. Okay, so now to actually looking at how we would test emergency operations. We don't just want to, we're not just testing this for fun. This is based off of a technique used in military and paramilitary operations, where there's this protocol called 2 is 1, 1 is none. You always want to have an extra recovery option in place nearby for when habitat failures occur. So if something happens, oh, these are not moving. That's unfortunate. If something happens in one of the habitats, you would have the idea in this pale red dot mission is when something occurs, a critical failure occurs in the habitat, you take the people who live in this village, have them go on EVA and move to the other village. That way they're out of harm's way and you have time to then send some people back over, evaluate the failure, see if it's something that can be fixed or not before you decide whether you have to abort the mission. Okay, so the idea is if you're trying to do this 10-year surface mission or any long-term surface mission, you don't want an unexpected failure to cause a mission abort that would make it impossible for you to do the science that you were sent there to do. So you have a lot more self-recovery options when you have this 2-village structure. All right, next one. So in a single village architecture, even if you have a large crew, but you put them in one village, your options become much more limited because you don't have that backup to go to another habitat. You have to either fix it or leave. There's nowhere else to go. Okay, so when we look at actually testing this in an analog facility, we had our 2 missions, our Pale Red Dot mission and Project Madeline. So we simulated the emergency in both. In one mission, it was a life support system failure. In the other, it was a simulated fire. We had a self-rescue. So in the Pale Red Dot mission, we performed that self-rescue EVA, moved it to the other village, sent the repair crew to go assess the damage, decide what needed to be done, and we were eventually able to recover to that 2 habitat site. In the MDRS mission, we worked with mission control to contain the failure and then continue on with the mission. In both cases, the metrics that we evaluated were the time to identify the failure, assess it, fix it, and get everybody back to a safe living situation. And then also a series of questionnaires to evaluate the psychosocial impacts and things, effects on things like a sense of security in the mission and how willing you are to continue on the mission, if you know that it might fail again. And so this is going to be this will be published in a master's thesis soon, so results are coming soon. All right, so to wrap up a little bit, the need for this flexible architecture this flexible analog mission structure is to be able to test different architectures. So using our Pale Red Dot analog mission that we had designed and implemented ourselves, we ended up having a lower cost mission. We were $70 per person per day cheaper than the other commercially available missions. We also see that we can test different mission architectures. We're not constrained to these pre-existing mission structures. So we can really evaluate more options for that. And next. Okay, and then just to wrap up, the mission overall was co-led by George Lordos, especially in the mission architecture. So huge shout out to him. These are the publications that I would recommend taking a look at if you're interested in the mission architecture or in some of the analog design work. And then a huge shout out goes to the crews of both projects. And happy to take any questions.
There it is. Okay. All right, questions. Here we go. Here's James.
Do you have any advice on how the MDRS program could incorporate safety drills into every crew mission?
Yes, absolutely. And I would be happy to talk with you more about that. Yes. We have some proposed protocols written up for future missions that we're planning on doing. So absolutely.
Is that something you have readily available to like send out to this community?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So get your protocols over here. Let's see here. Got to find my way over here to Jesse.
Oh shit. Excuse me. Excuse me, guys. Sorry about that. Two questions. One, who was the illustrator of the Madman frog? It was really cool. I thought that was pretty cool. Do you know?
Yeah, my gymnastics coach does design on the side.
So shout out to gymnastics coach for the great illustration. Second, to add on to the MDRS safety drilling, have you guys thought of Martian combat training to add into that safety training? It's just a thought, just a thought.
What, for the two crews to fight each other, the villages?
I mean, if we're gonna bring a couple over to this side, we gotta,
I'll lead that training, don't worry.
yeah, to have some fun with it, right? That's it. Anybody else want to take this from me?
More questions. Here we go, coming up front.
Right, super cool and excited to see MIT represented here. I was curious with your setup with the RVs, were you part of that simulation? Can you tell us a little bit more of like, what did that look like? How did you kind of simulate like airlock and that kind of community experience? I'm really curious.
So our airlock was actually through the bathroom because it had a door from both sides. So we got one of the key components, I think I mentioned thriving as a requirement. So we got luxury RVs. There was space for each person. We had all of the features. We were, another principle of the Peridot mission is we're water rich and energy rich. So we weren't constrained on showers or water usage in the way that analog missions currently are. We were able to kind of use the open spaces, and another aspect of the ISRU and industrial system capabilities there was that we were throughout the mission constantly building out habitable space in terms of setting up tents, adding extra like canopy areas for living spaces. So the most constrained area, or the most constrained time, was that first night of like landing and setup. And then from there, we immediately started building out and expanding to create extra living spaces to have that community aspect.
Is it all documented? Like, is there some way to see this simulation?
That will be in the master's thesis.
All right, next, let's see.
All right, since your topic's a little bit on operational risk management, can you go into a little bit of the modeling and sim and what frameworks and standards that you use?
So the modeling that we did was primarily based off of a list of 256 crew time tasks. It was based in this crew time model to begin with. And so this goes down into like, it breaks every aspect of astronaut time down into how long it takes you to put your dish away after washing it, like to that level of detail. Okay. From there, we added in, we did a whole series of simulations that looked at how this changes when we change the technologies that are available, when we change the number of crew, when we look at things like building off of that last talk. One of our aspects was to dig tunnels into Mars to add in that regolith shielding aspect. So when we change all these parameters of the mission architecture as a whole, it changes our risk analysis as a result. And so I can show you the model in more detail. Actually, I have it on my computer here. I can run through that model with you. But in terms of the risk management, we were looking at the time available to respond to emergencies as our key metric for that, as opposed to applying it to existing risk responses, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yep, sounds
Because we don't know, because there are unknown unknowns associated with Mars missions, so we don't know what scenarios are actually going to arise that we need to respond to. So we figured crew time is the most valuable thing that we can use to respond to those.
Did they do any, say, MBSC modeling, digital engineering,
Yes.
like Cameo, Sparks, that type of stuff?
We built our own.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is a kind of a free-floating question, but it kind of ties with your work and the previous speaker's work. So we're trying to do our first mission in northern Kenya. It's a desert. And so I was very interested, both what you were talking about, a permanent build out, because we have a lot of sand. We have traditional techniques of building. And we also have people in Kenya who are doing recycled plastic fabrications. I think I thought about it and said, aha, so my ideas were there. So I definitely would like to see some kind of a partnership with the university there and with your work. Same here, because we said, well, how do we start? Well, we already know how to do the tents in the desert. That's what we know to do. But I was like, how do you simulate like an airlock? Well, we just lock them in and say, okay, you can't come out. And so I was very curious, how do you do that? And also, is your research such that you can include an African school in the university? Because we do have the students gearing up for this first mission in late September, early October this year.
Yeah, definitely. This was a heavily international partnership. So Pale Red Dot, actually, George is from Cyprus, and we worked with professors at the University of Cyprus to include the psychosocial aspects. Those were our psychology team. Pale Red Dot has 30 countries represented in it. So we would definitely be able to expand this and work with you.
And I just want to add in terms of some of the healthcare aspects of it, because I really wanted to see how would people from the global north really survive emotionally when you're actually doing something in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you're here, but you're just like down the road from somewhere. When you're 8 hours away from Nairobi and you're only with nomads, and I also want to see, what if we actually had some nomads who are used to being out there with nothing alongside? How would the psychology of that restraint, especially in an emergency situation, what would be the response? I think there is some opportunity for learnings and it's kind of a cross-cultural design of a project.
We should definitely talk after this about that. Absolutely, this is an area of interest that ties in more. This is my master's work that ties in heavily with my PhD work. I would love to talk more.
Any more questions for Madeline here? No? Fascinating, of course. And she'll be here all weekend, right? So make sure you have those conversations. Everyone give her another round.